There we go. And so it's not Chatham House rule as usual, and we'll send out, if Carrie's happy, we'll send out the recording afterwards. So what we're looking at and how we're going to do it today is Carrie will speak for around about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that, see how it goes. Her insights are built around the questions and topics from the WhatsApp group, from the questions you've sent us from across the 3 networks. So please do send me questions throughout. So if you go to chat, I'm sure you know this, if you go to chat, it should be enabled to just send me, the host, your questions, and I'll collate them as Carrie goes along, and then we'll do one of 2 things, and we'll play it by ear, essentially. Either, judging on how many questions we get and so on, we'll go into some great breakout rooms after Carrie's given us some thoughts, or if there's quite a few questions, we may leave that for another webinar, and instead we'll go through the questions. So hit chat, send us whatever is on your mind at the moment, and we'll play it by ear. But for now, let's introduce Carrie. Carrie, thank you ever so much for doing this. You are absolutely my go-to person on this subject, and I'm really glad you can do it. Previously with Virgin Holidays and First Choice, Carrie's 10-year career with News UK culminated in her role as HR Director for Editorial and Commercial across The Sun, The Times, and the Sunday Times, and she's now a consultant and qualified coach, specialising in complex and messy people problems. Is there any other kind, we wonder sometimes? So Carrie, thank you ever so much for doing this, and over to you.
Lovely, thank you, Richard, and thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's lovely to speak to you, and I've prepared some thoughts, I suppose, in response to your questions, but let me tell you, I suppose, a little bit about why I might have a viewpoint on this. So, as Richard said, I've worked in HR in many different guises, both learning development, management development, OD, and latterly as a HR director. I made the transition into what I classed as grown-up HR quite late in my career, many would argue. And I fundamentally believe in the difference that HR can make. So I suppose I'm here today with that being my sort of lens in terms of the conversation we might have. As Richard mentioned, my last 10 years in a corporate role was with News UK. It's a name you may know. Obviously, we had the opportunity to have our name dragged through the other newspapers and on the front of the BBC News channel for essentially improper behaviour, which culminated in having 30 journalists arrested for paying public officials. And during my time, I did have also 2 suicides. So those 2 events, I suppose, got me really thinking about extraordinary events and what they mean for us as HR professionals and what they mean for the organisations that we support. So hence why I specialise in that subject these days. And I've had the opportunity to study change and organisational development at ROFI. So I sort of very much bring the thinking that is what's going on here and how can I influence it in a positive way. So that was definitely the way I approach these sort of extraordinary events, I suppose, that I faced. In terms of this extraordinary event, I suppose I don't think any of us were prepared for a virus that stopped us leaving our homes and closed our local pubs and schools. So I cannot say that I had a scenario plan in my back pocket for this. But I think it's true to say most extraordinary events that we have, you don't have a scenario plan. So what am I noticing? You know, a few people mentioned that as they came on the call. I'm noticing my own discomfort at not being able to control my diary and plans for the future. I notice the pit of the stomach discomfort at that. And I know that's something I can't change, but it's uncomfortable as well. And I really feel, as a raging extrovert, as Christine well knows, I find it difficult not to be able to leave the house. So I'm really having to notice how that drains my energy. I share those 2 things, I suppose, because extraordinary events are human processes. And unless we can get in touch with our own experiences of them, we struggle to support other people. I'm also practicing looking for silver linings. So I'm a very dedicated mother of 2 dogs. It's not quite 3 dragons. And so I am enjoying the fact that I'm home every day to take them out. And I fear for how they're going to cope when I have to go back out of the house again. But that's a problem for another day. I'm enjoying, the fact that I can practice yoga every day, which is one of my passions. And I've always had an excuse in the past for not doing that. So enjoying the no excuse part of that, and noticing that even without an excuse, I can still put it off. And also, I'm really enjoying experimenting with what's possible virtually. I've had the opportunity to run a development program over the last year for a large client where everything is virtual. And I think it's really interesting to notice our own discomfort with what virtual means for us. So it's great to see us all embracing the way of meeting in a different way today. So noticing the silver linings, I suppose. And as I say, I share those things with you because they're part of who we are, and the work we do with humans means we need to be really, I suppose, in touch with ourselves and our own experiences of extraordinary events. So there were a few questions that Richard shared with me that you guys had posed, and I thought I'd share some observations and thoughts around those questions. So one of the questions were, what were the 2 or 3 things that I've learned about managing extraordinary events from my experience? I ended up with 4, I'm afraid. I'm not quite sure I stuck to the brief there. But I think the first one is, I think in extraordinary events, you see who people really are. I think when they're under pressure, when they're feeling discomfort, they find it more difficult to hide their true self. So I think you learn a lot about the people you work with and what they have the capacity to cope with and not. Certainly, I remember being really surprised about the people that could cope and the people that couldn't. And it's quite obvious when they're not. So I think that's definitely one of the things that I've noticed. I've noticed that there's a temptation for businesses, and HR can follow that lead very easily, to focus on the short term, to focus with what's going to happen this week, what's going to happen this day. And whilst that's really helpful at the start, very quickly your ability to think beyond that is important. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think in the environment we're in now, if we think beyond today, if we think beyond next week, I'm really curious about how this situation and people's experience might make them want to work differently. So, what's it going to look like if, when we say to everybody, welcome back to the office, they all say, actually, we're fine at home, we'd rather have flexible working? What happens if 80% of our workforce lodge an application for flexible working? For me, that's an example of thinking beyond today. And I think in extraordinary events, it's very tempting to stay in the here and now. And my big invite would be to create headspace to do both. Number 3 would be put on your own oxygen mask first. So someone else mentioned that, they were talking about what's it like to be in lockdown for yourself. Well, give yourself time and the space to make sense of your own experience. I know the difference on the days when I was coping with something difficult and I found myself moving into action too quickly without really letting myself understand maybe my own sadness or anger or frustration of what was happening, and noticing the real difference between those 2 situations. And then my fourth one would be, what a crisis, an extraordinary event gives you is an opportunity for new things being possible. So things that previously people would have said can't be done, suddenly can be done. And so it creates a great opportunity for large shifts in how organisations work. And I wonder what COVID is going to make us possible for us as HR professionals as we think about what the new normal. I think someone even said that as they came on. What does the new normal look like? And what do we want to be deliberate around that? So rather than let it happen, how do we actually look and think, well, actually, what is it that I want to make possible through this change? Those would be my learnings really about extraordinary events. If we think about communications, I think this is a really interesting subject. I would say when it comes to communications, make the lawyers and your PR colleagues your friends, because when it comes to events like this, you'll often find that you have different perspectives about what you want to communicate and how you want to communicate it. The lady who just come on, Carly, she just talked about the fact that managing partners were getting a bit bored of sending out a daily email. Well, it's hard to think about what to say. And it's really tempting to stick with sort of corporate, safe blandness. Those are the first emails that you write. And those are the ones that lawyers like because they're safe. And And I definitely use my relationships to influence them to be braver and be more human in what you said. I think Richard may have shared, I've written a blog talking about this, and I think he shared it in advance of today. And I'm really 3 sort of things that help you get beyond that blandness. The first one being, think about what your stance is. So what do you want to represent during this period? So Carly, you know, if you want people to understand that you're a human because you have a cat and you go for a run and you're coping with this like a human too, you know, that sounds like a great stance. And I think I do believe that in a crisis, it is possible, if you're deliberate about your stance, to actually increase employee advocacy. Because in the same way that we see what people are made of when bad things happen, when difficult things happen, our employees see what we're made of, our organisations are made of when difficult things happen and what we prioritise. Yeah, I would take a few moments. It's tempting to move into action, but take some time to think about what is your stance, what is it that you want to show up around during this period. And also, I think this is a perfect example of something where the answers aren't obvious. You know, we don't know when we're going back to normal, and so it's a great opportunity to practice the question that many senior people resist, which is, I don't know. So how do you practice saying, I don't know? And then ask the question, what do you think? Because actually being open about not knowing is really helpful, and inviting people to contribute and get involved in helping shape your response, your approach, will increase employee advocacy. That will help you go back to a new normal with higher engagement for your workforce, because they will remember when they were feeling uncertain what you did, because their emotions and attention is heightened at the moment in a way that they wouldn't normally be the case. The next question was, what was the one thing that really surprised me when it didn't work? And the honest answer to that is that I was surprised at how my senior colleagues avoided difficult conversations. So when the chips were down and something difficult had to be done, I remember the feeling of everybody's eyes turning to me and them saying, right, well, that's something you're going to do, isn't it? I was like, okay. When did I become chief difficult conversation master? I was really surprised at the sort of bravado versus practice. So lots of bravado, but when the chips were down, the question was, were people prepared to have those conversations? And that really started to get me curious about to what extent I was part of that dilemma. So, you know, as a HR person, we can often find ourselves operating as a fixer, the person that sorts the difficult stuff out that doesn't fit anywhere else. And if I kept stepping in to do that, well, actually, it made it really easy for other people not to have to. So you'll also get some really useful data right now about how your business perceives you and the contributions that you offer them. Now, the downside of being a fixer is that, you know, you're the one doing the doing, and in which case you often end up carrying responsibility for the doing. So I certainly started to experiment with what being a thinking partner meant. So if I started to shift, if I changed my behavior, how could I actually help my leaders think for themselves and do for themselves in a way that built their competence, so the emphasis wasn't on me? And sometimes that worked and sometimes that didn't. I'm not saying it's a foolproof plan, but certainly in noticing people's discomfort, I started to get curious. How could I actually build their confidence? And actually, was I contributing to that discomfort? What did I learn about managing up or across was one of the questions. So maybe my peers or the people above me. I noticed that they were quick to talk about actions and tasks and activities and slow to talk about themselves and how they were. So I started today talking a bit about me and how I am, and that was something I practiced in an extraordinary event, making a deliberate point of talking about how are you with my senior colleagues. and listening to the answer and not doing it as the usual, how are you, fine, how are you, fine, and carrying on, really listening to the answer and paying attention to it. And being an instrument of change myself by talking to them about the days when I wasn't okay. Certainly, I noticed a habit in myself in HR that I would say I was okay even if I wasn't. And that didn't make it possible for them not to be okay. So how do I start to be more open and honest and make it possible for them to say they weren't okay? And, you know, I can think of times when I sat with senior people and we both had a cry because of what was happening, and made it possible for them to be okay with that, and for me to say that that was okay. Um, I think the other thing I noticed about managing up or across is there's very much a temptation to want to end up with something that felt simple. So there's a tendency to focus on things that you can cascade, like we could do this thing, we can send it out to everybody, then it's available to all. And that felt an easy thing to manage. But actually, in extraordinary events, people need different stuff. And that actually, in order to know about the different stuff, they needed to be prepared to get into a conversation about it. So notice a temptation to want to, you know, roll out something that feels easy because you can put your finger on it, and resist the temptation to do that and actually look for ways to engage in conversation that help you understand so that what you offer is actually going to help people. The classic one for that is having a counsellor on hand, for example. You know, it's a simple thing to organise and it feels like it helps. In my experience, no one ever goes to see them. So, you know, that isn't the solution. So again, a temptation to sort of focus on the thing that feels easy. The next question was, how did I personally stay focused and look after myself when I was experiencing extraordinary events? I suppose that started by knowing myself quite well. The benefit or disbenefit, depending on your perspective of going to Roffey to do a master's, is you get confronted with your own, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, Richard, but your own shit, basically. So it's not easy to avoid. And so I think I went into my extraordinary events pretty clear about my own ups and my own downs, and understanding that they would help me and also trip me up. And that meant, I suppose, that I was able to sit in other people's discomfort. So as a HR people, we can often ourselves want to get into fixing things for other people. And actually, sometimes what they need is for us to sit with their discomfort. And I definitely had to practice doing that. I have had a supervisor for probably 10 years now. So somebody that helps me look after myself, because that isn't a habit that I'm particularly good at. I'm very good at looking after other people, not good at looking after myself. So I get my own help with that. And, you know, if we were in counselling, we'd all have a supervisor. I'm always curious about the fact that as HR professionals, we can resist thinking we need that. And I definitely found that helps me manage myself and stay focused. And probably the third would be the sort of more honest answer, which is less sort of yogic and sort of purist, which is lots of wine and lots of inappropriate humour. I think many people say that ERs are the place where you have the dirtiest humour, and I would argue that HR departments are actually those places. So on the days when it got really bad, my team and I would drink a lot and laugh a lot and hope that nobody heard us, because we were in an open plan office. So those are the days I was probably most scared that someone might be listening. And finally, the last question was my team. How did I look after them? I suppose, well, being honest on the days that I wasn't okay and making it possible for them to not be okay. Regular check-ins to see how they were and how they were coping. It sounds simple as a principle, but often isn't actually practiced. And actually being really honest about what we were in. We didn't try and pretend it was okay. I think on our particularly difficult days, we did laugh about the fact that if we ever went for an interview and someone said, have you dealt with a difficult situation? We were pretty confident we could ace the answer to that question. And that was the reason we were staying, was because we were learning how to do this. And we would always have that answer in our back pocket. And quite frankly, there weren't any textbook answers. We were making them up, because I certainly typed in crisis HR when I was appointed as HR to the Sun into Google, and pretty much found there wasn't an answer to that problem. So we were going to have to make it up, and in making it up, it gave us freedom to experiment with what worked. So yeah, that would be my lessons learned for my team. So I'm hoping that gives you some food for thought, and also, I suppose, doesn't try and put a gloss on what can often be talked about as an easy thing to do. It's anything but.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Carrie. That's great. We have had two questions. In fact, thinking about it, what I'd like to propose is I'll give you the two questions in just a second. They're quite meaty. But also what I suggest is if anyone just drops me a line, a chat, and just says me, as long as it's clear who you are, which it isn't always, I'll basically say question from whoever, and then you can unmute yourself. And then ask the question, and we'll get that little conversation going rather than do breakout rooms for this one as well, if that's okay. So just hit the chat and say who you are, and then I'll turn over to you. But first of all, there's two questions. First of all, from Georgina, question is, Carrie, when you were saying that you can, some people, I think let's get the right quote, sorry. In extraordinary events, you see who people really are. So what Georgina was saying in terms of coping, is there a risk of bias? When some people are coping better than others? Is there an implication perhaps taken from other people that they're not good at their job if they're not coping? How do you cope with that and the potential bias?
Well, I suppose it comes back to, I suppose, what aren't they coping around? So it's very difficult to learn how to deal with a crisis when you're in one. That's not the time to learn. So I think some people have a natural capacity to cope, and it comes back to sort of core resilience. So for the people that aren't coping, it's really hard to teach them at the moment that you need them to have it. I suppose in terms of bias, I think the question is, what can you do to help people build that? That would be my question. If you look at the leaders that you have and their capacity, it's hard to build the capacity when you're in it and you need it. I would invite you to think about how you build that in advance or afterwards. Certainly when we did key events, we would do a reflection session and give each other feedback. So how do you build, if you can't build it in the situation, how do you build it afterwards to help them understand that that's something they need to pay attention to?
Okay, excellent, thank you. And then from Tesha Adams, what support did you draw on inside and outside the business? So how did you support yourself and others, particularly with the suicides and that incredibly difficult moments, times?
I think News UK would be described as quite a bullish culture. So I think it would be described as high challenge and low support. So the honest answer is it's not a place where you get a lot of support. So I was lucky in that I knew I needed it and I got it from outside. And that involved a very frank conversation with my boss, which was, I need extra support. I don't see it around here. Am I missing that? And he was honest and said no. And so I got that support elsewhere in the ways that I've described. We did lean on expertise where we were missing it. So having looked at our suicides, they were very different. We did investigate them to understand them, which I found immensely hard, having dealt with both the families as well. I think we did learn that we actually needed to do some things better. So, for example, in one of our functions, it had a very work hard, play hard culture, and that meant naturally alcohol and drugs were part of that. Now, at my team, I didn't have expertise in how to tackle that. So under an umbrella of a sort of larger piece around well-being, we did bring in experts to support our understanding of how to spot alcohol abuse, how we might influence it, and also how do managers talk about it. So, if your team come back from a sales lunch and they smell of alcohol and they do it once, is that okay? What if they do it 3 days in a row? And what do you say if you think that that's getting out of hand? We got expert advice on that. And also we did, I do believe in peer support. So I am trained in using something called, it's a company called March on Stress, and they roll out a training program where you have people in your organization who are trained to spot and talk to people that are struggling and know how to refer them on. So I use expertise for that too.
And what about for, and sorry, did that include support for others within, say, the HR team who are also struggling to cope with what was going on?
Well, I think the HR team are in an interesting place. You know, we certainly knew that one of our gentlemen we lost to suicide. We knew he was struggling, but he wasn't prepared to talk to us. So, you know, people will hide how they are. The evidence, the research says that they're more likely to tell their colleague than they are to tell somebody in a position of authority, and you know, HR would be considered in that camp. So that's why we invested in having people from around the business who were looking out for each other, and they would, with permission, come and tell us they were concerned about somebody. But I think we can't always expect that people will tell us that they're not okay. They're more likely to tell their colleague. And as you know, if you haven't trained people, you're relying on them knowing what to do. So yeah, this peer coaching, peer support network it is that March on Stress run, I found immensely helpful and is still in place now.
Excellent, thank you. We have 2 more questions, so keep them coming, or just drop us a line if you'd like me to turn to you. So from Sarah Allingham, how do you manage being part of multiple teams when in high demand?
Great question. Well, contract carefully about what they can expect from you. So I think as HR teams, well, no, I won't speak as HR teams. I know that I find it difficult to say no, because if I can help, I feel like I should. And I've got better because I practiced at managing my boundaries and being clearer with people about what was possible and what wasn't. And that meant moving some of my relationships from, I described earlier, a fixer who would do stuff for people that was helpful, into saying, I can't do stuff for you at the moment, but what I can do is spend an hour with you to help you think about what you can do. So influencing and changing some of the relationships where what they needed and wanted wasn't possible, I think would be one of the things I notice I practice when confronted with that.
Thank you. And then one from Geraldine Haley, who's actually speaking in our 3rd webinar. Welcome, Geraldine. She says, what's the one thing you would do differently, knowing what you know now? Don't say drink more wine.
Well, Christine would probably say, yes, I should drink more wine. But I think look after myself better. Yeah, I definitely, that's still something I'm working hard at. I'm someone that moves into action quickly, and when I move into action before I look after myself, I'm just a less good version. So I might be quicker, but what I ended up doing wasn't as good, and that's something I'm continuing to work at.
Geraldine says, great answer.
Thank you, Geraldine.
And from Lisa Baker, given our current reality, what have you seen work well to help leaders frame or develop approaches for an unknown future?
So the clients I'm supporting, we've talked a lot about communication. So people are finding how to meet, what to do, and how to be quite hard. And so I would invite you to talk to your staff about what they need and want. So when I ask the question, what do you know about people, what people need and want? Usually the answer is they don't know, because they're too busy trying to solve a problem without asking the question. One of my clients, when they asked the question, the answer was, we'd love to see people. So we can't, this audience is people that don't sit in front of computers, they're out supporting hands-on. And the one thing they were missing was actually seeing the faces of the senior people. So they didn't like emails. So he switched to doing 2-minute bi-weekly video where he talked about what was going on, what he knew, what he didn't know, and how he was. And it made a fundamental difference to how engaged people were feeling. So I think the big thing I've noticed is the businesses I'm supporting, they start with, right, we need to do this better, but they need to just pause for a moment and start to ask questions. What do people need and want? Some people are really enjoying working from home, and some people aren't. Some people want more connection, some people don't. How do we get curious about that rather than jumping into action? And it comes back to what I said earlier, also jumping into action and cascading something out without having a dialogue. I've certainly spoke to a couple of clients where they've already rolled out, maybe a access to a particular mindfulness tool or something with really good intentions, but then they're finding it's not being taken up because it isn't the thing that actually people need or want. So have a conversation.
Well, talking of which, that's very timely because we have 2 communications questions here, for which thanks. So, how can you convince your managers to listen to their teams and employees? I mean, particularly in the culture you were describing, perhaps.
I think the honest answer to that is what I describe as guerrilla HR. So I would let people do things wrong until they were ready to hear what they needed to hear, because I don't think you can convert people that aren't listening. So in my experience, there's always a point at which a manager gets themselves into a pickle when they need you, and that's the moment that you can convert them. So you can give people advice and they'll ignore it because they think they know best, or they don't. I mean, we've got to be honest. We're in a profession where sometimes people don't respect our opinion. So I would let them do it wrong until they needed me. And we in my team, we called that guerrilla HR, which is we'd sort of hide in the bushes until they needed us, and then we'd be ready.
I hope you've trademarked that.
I don't think you'll find that in any textbook. So.
No, but maybe in a practical work, but I like that. Guerrilla HR, excellent. Okay, and then the follow-up question, but how important do you feel visual communication means are, and what advice would you give to those only able to work remotely by voice alone?
Well, for some people that's enough, and for others it isn't. So get curious about the ones that are struggling with that. Don't assume. I listened to a great podcast this week, and the lady asked Alain de Botton, I think it actually is a Christine recommendation, how are single people coping with this? And he basically slapped the interviewer and said, how dare you assume that single people aren't coping? Like, we're all human beings, but let's not be crudely classifying our audience of who's coping and who isn't. So some people will be. I'm definitely in conversations with some people where they don't want this communication. They don't want face to face. They don't need it, and other people do. So get curious about what people need and don't need, and then look at ways to get it to them. What's wrong with someone senior doing a 2-minute homemade video and circulating that around so that it's available when people can watch it, if that's what they need? That was a slightly feisty answer.
No, but it's a good one, because I think to the original question, I think it's we are making assumptions about what people prefer to do in terms of the visual and the audio. We've all sort of essentially gone on Zoom, he said, going on Zoom. So yes, it's not for everyone. I take that point. We're getting towards the end, I think. So if there's one more question that pops up, then we can cover that off. But I just, while we wait for that to come or not, just to say, Christian, who was on earlier and is still on the call, is doing our next webinar, which is this Monday, 2:30 to 3:15. Christian's an author and exploring supporting you and your teams who have children. So let me know if you haven't signed up to that, or sign up to the diary invitation. We'll pop the Zoom link across tomorrow. I think that's it for questions. Carrie, just thank you ever so much. Please feel free to react to Carrie on the reaction button. Very glad to have you along. Excellent. And we're going to send out a deck that you've got, I know, after the session, and we'll review the recording. For now, forgive me, this is offensively obvious, everyone. I'm taking my cue slightly from Carrie here. Just to say, don't forget to look after yourself, everyone, because we're not always so good at that in HR, I don't think, with our focus on the wider organisation. So stay connected. We've got online check-ins, we've got buddy schemes, these webinars, the WhatsApp groups. You know this stuff, but we're all here to help you in a small but I hope powerful way. End of sermon. You know this stuff, but we all know how busy you are, and we're here to help. Good luck for now. Carrie, thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully see you Monday. All the best.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much.